Hello, I'm Bod Booker and welcome back to my channel. So, as you may be aware, we are in Booker season again, and I am reading through the Longlist at the moment, and I have been very lucky to have been given an advance copy via Eric Karl Anderson and over at Lonesome Reader, and as a result I've been able to read this, and you may be able to tell through my attractive array of post-it notes that I had some thoughts as I was going through this book. I mean, short, long story short, I adored this book. I thought it was incredible. I thought it was just so moving and powerful and clever and just brilliant on so many levels. I really want to talk a little bit about it today. So I'll sort of give a bit of a summary at the beginning, and then I will go a little bit into spoiler territory, which I will announce. But I just thought I'd give you a heads up because I know this is a book that lots of people have been really looking forward to reading. It's not out yet. It comes out in September, so not out yet at the time of me making this video. It's the only book on the long list to not yet be out. But I just think it is such a beautiful book. And I am now incredibly excited about this being on this long list. So, to start us off, Richard Powers, well known for winning the Pulitzer for the Overstory, which was also shortlisted for the Booker. Richard Powers was also longlisted before for Orfeo. In 2014, so he's necessarily no stranger to the Booker, but especially since obviously US authors have sort of been allowed for since US authors have been allowed, his books have been on the list, and I think that's quite telling, just because he is such a powerful writer. And this is the first book of his I've read, and I, based on the strength of this, very much need to go back and read absolutely everything he's ever written, because this is a remarkable piece of literature. So the story is all about this man Theo, who is looking after his young son Robin, also sometimes called Robbie throughout the text. And we learn quite early on a few sort of details about their relationship. So the mother, Alyssa, or Ali, or Ally as she sometimes is, sort of tragically died. But we learn a little bit more about her backstory, that she was a campaigner for both the environment and sort of more specifically around animal welfare. Theo, the husband, is an astrobiologist, largely looking at kind of patterns of life and the kind of how to kind of keep advancing science in sort of for humanity, essentially. So what can we learn from other life forms out there and from other planets? How can we kind of keep continuing to learn, and what does that tell us about us as people on Earth? And we learn a little bit more about the son, Robin. And Robin, named after his mother's favourite bird, is a young child who we're kind of presented with in this kind of very interesting kind of way at first, and we sort of are meant to sort of see him as being a little bit othered by society. We know that he's sort of been bullied at school, and we very quickly learn that he is autistic. And there's a really interesting line early on where Theo, the father, is talking, and we get all of this through Theo's perspective. It's all in the first person, and we get this perspective about about Robin being on the spectrum, and Theo, both as a sort of scientist and also a father who's somewhat frustrated by the way that people are talking about his son, says, well, of course he's on a spectrum. That's how spectrums work. Everyone's on a spectrum. And sort of takes issue with how that's sort of being framed and kind of thought about. But nonetheless, we learn more about him, and we realise increasingly that there is a world, the world around them is something quite hostile and something quite difficult, not only for everybody on the planet in sort of various different ways, but for a young child like Robin, who is autistic, is sensitive to a lot of the changes and a lot of things around him. He is really struggling. He's sort of having breakdowns at school. He's getting in fights. He is just really unable to kind of know how to sort of fit within that sort of way of being. And in the meantime, we get all this sort of these stories of Robin and Theo and their relationship, this kind of beautiful father-son relationship where the father is looking out as best he can for his son, but also doesn't really know what to do. And one of the first sort of questions that comes up is about using drugs, or some kind of medication to stop, well, to kind of manage Robin's moods, and to help him sort of flatten out or even out in that sense. But Theo, as we learn quite quickly, has a massive issue with this. He hates the idea that his son would be sort of given quite heavy medication from the age of about 9, and that seems to be a big bone of contention, and that theme plays into some really important parts later in the novel as well. And before I go on to some other bits that are a little bit spoilery, I kind of wanted to talk a bit about how these sort of themes interconnect. And so we are therefore presented with this idea right from the beginning about science versus nature in quite a sort of basic way at first, of the idea of medication and sort of science and sort of progress in that sense, and what that will do to the natural inclinations or fears or thought patterns of young Robin. And that it sort of sets up some other really interesting discussions later. We also get a lot of science versus nature in a broader sense. So not only the fact that, Robin is essentially the product of an astrobiologist in his father, who is really interested in kind of looking at very kind of heavy scientific forms, and then his mother, who is, is still very scientific in a lot of her outlook, but is really interested in this idea of what ethics around harm. And we kind of get sort of things quite early on about her. So she's vegetarian, and she doesn't believe it, and she sort of actively campaigns against animal abuse, and she deals with so many other topics, and goes and campaigns and fights with legislators to get things changed. And so we've got this really interesting discussion set up right from the beginning about those two things, and it's just so beautifully done. I think, again, that some of those discussions aren't necessarily new, but I think what really ties this novel together in such a beautiful and powerful way is that this novel never loses sense of love and of hope throughout the book. So the love between Theo and Alyssa, the love between father and son, and between mother and son, always throughout the book is just so beautiful. It's so tender. Characters are so sort of almost selfless in their love for each other. And what's so brilliant about that is this book, that could feel really cliched and cheesy and whatever else if it wasn't handled cleverly and well. And I think what's so beautiful about this book is that it manages to make that not feel at all like a cheesy quick win kind of thing of just like, oh, they really love each other, what a nice family. It's so deep. I genuinely sort of throughout this book almost sort of at times wondered if the woman Richard Powers was writing about was someone he knew well, or was writing about his own children, because the love in the book is so deep and so beautiful that it kind of really captures that. And I think it feels so real. It never really felt like a piece of fiction, which is kind of remarkable, really. And I think as well, kind of related to that, what is just so stunning is how the language is so tight, but never really feels over-edited or over-controlled. I've got some examples, as you may notice, from my kind of little weird pink filing system that was going on here. But just some absolutely gorgeous moments. So early on, this is really early on, so don't worry, this isn't a spoiler as such, but this is Theo talking about his own family and how his family is incredibly marked and different in terms of than the family he's now got. And he says, hell everywhere. The details are blissfully fuzzy now. I grew up fast. By rough count, my mother harbored 6 different personalities inside herself, and half of them were capable of doing me and my 2 older sisters real harm. By the time my father commenced his slow suicide by painkillers, I'd already traded in boy soprano for the more demanding hobby of sitting in my room and panicking. When I was 13, Dad made us kids scrub up and sit behind him in court as he was sentenced for embezzling. The ploy must have worked because he only got 8 months. But we lost the house, and my father never again earned more than minimum wage. I wouldn't have made it through those years without brains in a vat, Dyson spheres, arcologies, spooky action at a distance, Afrofuturism, retropulp, and psi machines. From alpha beams to the Amiga point, I lived in a parallel space that spawned scenarios of such infinite variety that they made a laughingstock of the little parochial rock in the galactic sticks where I lived. Nothing could hurt me so long as consensual reality was just a tiny atoll in an ocean without shores. That is, I mean, that's beautiful. Like, that is gorgeous. And I think is such an and again, sets up some really interesting premises in the book. So this idea that Theo, as a child, his escape from the cruelties of the world was to sort of surround himself and lose himself in being in that childlike sense of wonder at the natural world and of science. So, you know, getting lost in science fiction and in biological experiments and TV shows and anything that allowed him that escape from reality. And we see that again with his own son, that there is a real desperate attempt to kind of focus in on the good things. And this is where we're going to get into a little bit of spoiler territory. So if you want to pause here and then come back once you've read the book, please be my guest. So to start with a few sort of light spoilers here, we learn increasingly as they go that there is essentially a type of treatment that is being offered, experimental though it is, to try and help young Robin manage his autism, and particularly manage the kind of anxieties and fears that he often has. And we also learn quite soon as part of this, quite early on as part of this, that a lot of his anxieties, when they speak about it, it's a really cleverly done point of actually a lot of his anxieties are really quite natural, in the sense that this book is set in the era of Trump, although Trump, I believe, is never mentioned by name. Well, again, we don't necessarily know it's Trump. I mean, I think it's a fairly easy guess that it is. He's never mentioned by name, but it does talk about some policies that are bizarrely close to Trump's ones. So there we go. And that point kind of comes up of actually it is perfectly natural to be feeling incredibly anxious and overwhelmed in a world that we're currently living in, with someone like Trump, with wars globally, with poverty, with the decline of the natural environment, and particularly the destruction of it. This is, I think, where this book sings and is so brilliant, because the love and hope that I mentioned earlier, that is used in this book so beautifully to counteract the feelings of everything around us. Kind of like in Damon Galgut's The Promise, where we end the book on a note of hope, because actually to leave out that sense of hope would mean everything is almost worthless and pointless. And I think that's what's really clever about this book, is that you never really give up sense of hope. None of the characters do, really. And when they start to, so when at one point young Robin starts losing his sense of hope, he wonders how his mother ever used to do it. His mother, who, you know, sort of tirelessly fought in kind of campaigns, and we get this really brilliant description of her sort of sleeping 3 hours and then coming up and doing something else, and just kind of constantly moving between all these myriad tasks. And little Robin, he sees her and just sort of, he only sees the good stuff, essentially. He only sees her getting up, fighting, doing the things that she needs to do. And he's really inspired by this. But Theo, our narrator, can obviously let us in on more information. And we find out very quickly that, you know, she used to come home and cry at night. And sometimes she'd have these horrific nightmares of animal abuse or of hopelessness. And it was really difficult for her to get out of those holes. And this, again, is where this gorgeous sort of moment comes in that feels really very sort of sci-fi, but also very real in a quite a scary way. So the program that Robin is using to sort of manage his autism, or to at least manage his anxieties about the world, seems to be working, but he is also sort of still feeling quite overwhelmed. And they basically tap into a program of a recording of some emotions of Alyssa, his mother, from a while back. And there's a bit of a backstory because although Theo and Alyssa did it as a couple, the person administering it was someone who Alyssa had previously dated. And so there's this odd current day relationship between Theo and his wife's ex, essentially. And what sort of comes up from that is Robin accessing his mother's memories, and as a result of accessing those memories, essentially starting to become her. And this sets up again a really interesting question of how much of human nature can we copy and borrow, and how much can we overlap with other humans. And indeed, you know, this young boy starts to seemingly pick up traits and words that his father has never taught him, but that he essentially has gotten from recordings of his mother. And it is just brilliantly done, because suddenly you just are watching this young boy transform into essentially his mother. And what I thought was really interesting about how it's laid out on the page as well is all the way through, whenever Theo, our narrator, speaks, or anyone else really, well, pretty much everyone else apart from his son or his ex-wife, is you know, his text is presented in sort of, you know, just in speech marks. His son, and as we soon learn, his wife, all of their text is presented in italics. And so the first time that we hear something from the mother, we suddenly realize that the son and the mother are sharing, formally, you know, sharing the same way on the page. And whether that's just because that's Theo acknowledging kind of external people, you know, external speakers, it's really interesting that those two share that, and there's something kind of being forged there, even sort of at the subconscious level, on a sentence level, of how we receive this text, that we start to see the son and the mother as being similar and kind of sharing a lot of the same qualities. However, this, as you may then expect, some issues naturally start to come up, and at one point we learn that the program's going to have to be discontinued in some ways, and we learn that this is kind of happening at a time where Robin is making incredible progress. He is sort of functioning in a way that has allowed him to do things that they had never really thought possible before. A boy who previously hadn't really been able to fit in school is suddenly leading protests and being an activist and campaigning and going out and selling paintings, and kind of has this salesman patter that is really gorgeous and really brilliantly handled. And there's a sort of wonderful cameo, essentially, of someone who is basically Greta Thunberg, but not called Greta Thunberg. She's called, hang on, I'll find this because it's really funny. They just sort of suddenly bring up someone and just sort of give her a vaguely Scandinavian name, and they're like, this is clearly not Greta Thunberg, but also is Greta Thunberg, because she is a young autistic girl who talks about it being her superpower, who talks about her house being on fire, but nobody paying attention to it. It's cribbed heavily from Greta Thunberg, but maybe for legal reasons she isn't called Greta. And I thought that was really well handled, actually, because although it sort of seemed a bit cheesy, it did feel like a little nod and a wink and a bit of a sort of tongue-in-cheek joke. But there is this absolutely beautiful moment where Robin sees Greta Thunberg on TV, and hears her giving a speech about protecting the environment. And this is, you know, a boy who by this point has started his one-man campaign, has given up, you know, has skipped school, very, very similar to kind of Greta Thunberg's real-life campaigns. And he sort of, in doing so, he sees this young autistic girl talking about the environment on TV, and he says, she's like me. And there's this beautiful sort of heart sort of breaking moment and sort of heartwarming moment of that kind of realization for this young boy, that he starts, as Greta Thunberg says, to kind of see his autism as a superpower. He's seeing things that other people don't see. And indeed, throughout the book, Robin is kind of our second narrator almost. We get so much information through his eyes, and sort of indirectly through Theo himself, but we see so much through Robin's eyes and suddenly realise the gorgeousness of nature, while everyone else around is saying, oh, don't worry, do this next time, or you just need to follow these rules. He is arguing, actually, these animals are going extinct, or actually, the planet is coming to an end. What are you doing about it? And he sees something that other characters don't. And the book from there just continues to build with these really interesting ideas. And so there's something that happens quite early in the book, this really gorgeous description that I think sums up a lot of how this book is, where this book is looking, essentially. And that is, they share a lot, astronomy and childhood. Both are voyages across huge distances. Both search for facts beyond their grasp. Both theorize wildly and let possibilities multiply without limits. Both are humbled every few weeks. Both operate out of ignorance. Both are mystified by time. Both are forever starting out. And I mean, this writing is just like, how this man can write, and he writes his socks off in this book. It's just so beautifully done. And I think, you know, I very rarely cry or get that emotional when reading books, which I realise sounds really cold, but I think maybe because although it's a very personal experience reading, I think I'm always sort of, I sometimes can find it a little bit easier to step back. I got really quite emotional during this book because it's the love between characters is just so gorgeously done. And I think it covers just such interesting ground constantly. And it never really lets up. Like it could again have gone for the easy route on so many of these parts, but it doesn't. It just keeps going. And I think, so here we go. There's another bit here that I was just sort of looking for. And this sort of is about this idea of hope and futility around protesting. So the stillness confused Robin. Nobody else is protesting anything. Everyone in the state is perfectly happy with everything just the way it is. He'd based his idea of this place on video clips of his mother. This is the capital in Washington, D.C. He based his idea of this place on video clips of his mother. He wanted drama and showdown and righteous calls for justice from concerned citizens. Instead, he got America. I took my place alongside him. He erupted. His free hand slashed the air. Dad, what do you think you're doing? Doubling the size of your protest group. No freaking way. Go stand over there. I walked 30 feet down the pavement. He waved me farther off. Over there, far enough that no one thinks you're with me. And at first the father is really quite hurt by this, but then suddenly realizes what is going on here. That his son not only wants to do it alone, but also understands in a way that nobody else really has picked up on, kind of like Greta Thunberg's protests, that if he does this alone, it is seen as coming from this child as opposed to a father telling his child what to do. And he creates all these little signs, and this son of his, Robin, is just so beautifully painted as just so curious and inquisitive and intelligent. But also the moment when this funding stops for the program that he was doing, this sort of program that's really helped him sort of function a little bit better in wider society, he says things along the lines of, I'm going backwards. And he delivers it with such sort of finality and fear that it is genuinely heartbreaking on the page, because the father narrating the book knows it's true as well and is trying to comfort his son, but doesn't know how to say it, doesn't really know how to say, you're right, you are going backwards in whatever that means. You know, the progress you've made is now being unraveled, and we don't know what that means for you. And I think that is what is just so remarkable about this book for me. This book takes what could have been some sort of quite dicey or difficult or even cliched topics, and it injects it with so much love and hope that it counteracts and it balances with the very real feelings that many of us are also feeling at the moment of anger and hatred. You know, when dealing with some of the harsh political situations of the moment, and, you know, especially something like environmental collapse, anger and despair are really high and up in what many people are feeling. Love and compassion are a lot harder to grasp at when you are sort of under the thumb and when loads of things are happening. And this book manages to strike quite a rare balance, I think, of being incredibly angry at this president and at inaction and at systems that mean that this young boy can't get the help he deserves and needs, but also still manages to find a place of hope of how can the son keep that kind of love and focus and joy about the world. How can he stay almost childlike in his sense of wonder about the natural world around him? How can he keep fighting when times are against him? And that's again a lesson he learns from his mother. But ultimately this book does feel like one of hope. The ending is incredibly sad in how it handles something, but it almost by that point has started to feel inevitable. I know I've said this is sort of a spoilery section. I really don't want to spoil this part because I think if you've not read the book, I don't want that ending to hit. I don't want to spoil that because it's so beautifully handled. But I think ultimately this book gives you a sense that there is something worth fighting for, and we should all be a little bit more like Robin and fight to make that happen. So, as you may be able to tell, I kind of enjoyed the book. It was sort of the easiest 5 stars for me to give a book pretty much ever. Sort of about 10 pages in and I thought, yeah, probably a 5-star book here. You know, not gonna lie. And now a book that I absolutely would adore to see being on the Booker shortlist, and now alongside Damon Galgut's The Promise is one of my favourites to win. I think this is an absolutely stunning, fantastic, just original and thought-provoking book that is so well structured and written on a sentence-by-sentence level, but is also just phenomenal in in its scope. It's really ambitious for a book of about 270 pages, and I think it pulls it off. So if you've had a chance to read this book, I'd love to hear your thoughts. It's an emotional one, and apart from that, you know, this book will come out in September after the shortlist is announced. So we may see this book on the shortlist before the book actually comes out. But either way, if you do manage to get a chance to read it, I hope you really enjoy it. I've been Bob the Booker, and I'd also really, before I sign off, really would encourage you to check out Eric Karl Anderson's review of this book as well. It is so beautifully spoken about by Eric. I think Eric touches on some absolutely gorgeous points about it and really captures the joy and warmth of this book. So really do check that out. And thank you again to Eric for giving me said book to read. But anyway, take care. I hope you're all doing really well. And until next time, speak to you soon. Bye-bye.